don't understand what's going on here.
Give me a break, give me a break.
I don't understand what's going on here.
Give me a break, give me a break.
What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What? I don't understand. I don't understand.
I said it before and I'll say it again, it again, it again, it again. I said it before and I'll say it again, it again, it again, it again. I said it before and I'll say it again, 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 again. I said it before and I'll say it again, again, again. I said it before and I'll say it again.
I don't understand what's going on here.
Published in 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula was largely responsible for the growing popularity of the vampire, a term penned as early as 1734. German filmmaker F.W. Murnau was sued for his 1922 film Nosferatu on claims from the Stoker estate that it was a copy of the novel's plot. Bela Lugosi filled the cape for his first official appearance on the silver screen in 1931, and playwright Hamilton Dean first adapted the tale for the stage in 1942 as The Vampire Play, which was redesigned in '77 by Gothic artist Edward Gorey. By the time he made his first video game appearance in Ghost Manor for the Atari 2600 in 1983, he had already become the leader of an elite group of horror icons. The Count went on to cameo in King's Quest II, Romancing the Throne, and 3 games in 1986, Realm of the Undead for the ZX Spectrum, and 2 self-titled releases for the Commodore 64. They were the first British games to receive a 15 certificate from the Board of Film Censors for their gory images. The same year, Konami, known for developing PC, MSX, and arcade games, sought their own piece of this undead pie and finished development on a side-scrolling action platformer. It would not only include the infamous Lord of Vampires, but his Universal minions Frankenstein and the Mummy. It was one of their first titles for Nintendo. Castlevania was released on September 26, 1986 for the Famicom Disk System. America didn't see the NES version until May of the following year. It was known as Akumajo Dracula, or Demon Castle Dracula in Japan. Recent college graduate Kinuyo Yamashita composed the driving musical score, her first for the company. She went under the pseudonym James Banana in the game's infamously cryptic credits, leaving the rest of the staff largely unknown. Instead of the developers, the cast list credited campy puns of popular horror actors like Christopher Lee, Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney and Son, Barbara Shelley, Max Schreck, Glenn Strange, Andre Morell, and John Carradine. Terence Fisher, the director of over 2 decades worth of monster cinema for Hammer Films, and Dracula's own author were also parodied. Dracula was Castlevania's central villain, but the game was an obvious homage to a wide history of horror cinema, complete with film strip sprocket holes on the title screen. Stage-ending boss played a cameo straight from the movies. Medusa's inclusion is probably a reference to the Gorgon from 1964, while the first boss may come from 1933's The Vampire Bat. The Grim Reaper, shown in classic Western form, might be a nod to Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. The player controlled Simon Belmont, or Simon Belmondo, a vampire hunter armed with a whip and whatever weapon he could bust out of a nearby candle. A dagger, holy water, axe, watch, and cross lasted until death, or another weapon was picked up. Using them spent hearts, and the whip had to be upgraded twice at the beginning and after each life ticked away. Castlevania was not a long game. Speedrun records ranged between 12 and 13 minutes. Players originally took much longer than that due to the castle being quite the unforgiving challenge, with Frankenstein and Death dishing out most of the difficulty. Castlevania did not crack the top 50 best-selling games on the system, but it did receive ports and remakes aplenty. It was re-released for the Nintendo PlayChoice 10 and Versus series of arcade machines. PC, Amiga, and Commodore 64 versions launched in 1990. The Game Boy Advance saw a portable port in 2004, and it joined the Wii Virtual Console library in 2007. On Halloween in 1986, it was released as a port for the MSX2, a year before the original Metal Gear would arrive on the platform. It was renamed Vampire Killer and required players to collect keys that opened doors and chests. The environments, while featuring the same art and sound design, had to be ventured screen by screen, instead of scrolling like the Famicom. 2 years later, an arcade port dubbed Haunted Castle took a much more drastic departure from the original, pulling music from many other games in the franchise. The Sharp X68K, first released in 1987, gave Dracula a home in 1993 with an alternate visual style to match the updated hardware. This version flew over to the PlayStation as Castlevania Chronicles in May of 2001. That's one game re-released and reimagined 10 times, but none of those would have ever seen the light of day if Castlevania hadn't reanimated itself with additional installments. In 1986, the NES was beginning to gain momentum, and many fans bit by the series wanted more. Despite seeing the fortress crumble in the distance, it would be rebuilt. Castlevania was cursed to continue. Castlevania II: Simon's Quest was released on August 28, 1987. Again, it graced the Famicom before reaching the NES in December of 1988. Kenichi Matsubara stepped in to handle the score, and H. Akamatsu filled the director's chair. The sequel appeared on the second issue of Nintendo Power, and drew complaints from parents for Dracula's decapitated head. The gameplay differences were discovered by players instantaneously as Simon first appeared in a residential area full of patrolling townsfolk. Each of them had something to say, similar to the villagers added to Zelda in The Adventure of Link, released earlier the same year. They sold items and dropped clues as to how to complete the titular task: recover 5 remnants of Dracula's corpse, resurrect the immortal demon, and vanquish him for good. Hearts returned as the default currency, but they also leveled up Simon at certain intervals, similar to experience points. The whip had 4 upgrades now instead of 2, and they were permanent. The dagger was given 2 upgrades, gold and silver, and the diamond and sacred flame joined the arsenal, replacing the axe and watch. Garlic revealed secrets, laurels provided brief invincibility, and other trinkets like the cross and colored crystals opened hidden passages. Simon was also free to venture left as well as right, with the 7 hubs connected by forests, caverns, bridges, and rivers. To imitate the passage of time, the game would alternate between night and day. Citizens were only available to talk during the daytime, and monster health doubled after the sun went down. Each of Dracula's possessions was sealed inside a mansion. An oak stake needed to be bought in each one before the trophy could be unlocked, at which point the player marched out the way they came. Some fans weren't sure what to make of Simon's Quest. The clues were vague to say the least, so its guide became mandatory reading. The backtracking bumped up the playtime to several hours, with the fastest run clocked in at around 40 minutes. There were many NPC quips that were severely lost in translation, not to mention a prominent, reoccurring spelling error. Simon faced Dracula's 2 forms during a tense standoff in the first Castlevania, but merely needed to lay on his whip as the vampire formed at the end of the sequel to claim victory. Just like other slowly evolving 8-bit franchises, the RPG elements were a necessary, if clumsy, step. Castlevania II enjoyed enough success to warrant calling the Belmonts into battle once more. But Simon's quest was over, and he would sit the next adventure out. Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse was released on December 22, 1989, and entered the US market 9 months after its Japanese launch. Akamatsu returned as director, and Hidenori Maezawa, Jun Funahashi, and Yuki Morimoto shared the duty of composing the music. The third installment's protagonist, Trevor, was Simon's ancestor, and the events were played as a prelude to Castlevania I. After the first couple of screens, it looked like Dracula's Curse regressed to the original format. The town structure vanished, large wooden doors led to most new zones, and the familiar arsenal of weapons returned unchanged. Even Trevor looked nearly identical to his supposed offspring. The game initially played like another lengthy linear trial with 15 stages as opposed to the original's mere 6. But players soon discovered that there were also a good deal of important decisions to make. The first was which path to choose when the tattered map offered two alternatives. One traveled farther than the other in terms of overall progression, but both inevitably reached the same point. The second was the unexpected inclusion of three additional playable characters: Grant, Sifa, and Alucard. All three were unlocked after specific boss battles. Trevor then could choose whether to team up or separate. Press of the select button swapped control from Trevor to whichever hero was by his side. Grant, the thief, could walk on walls and ceilings and carried a small blade. Sifa, the sorcerer, wielded three forms of spells, and Alucard, the long-lost son of the big vamp himself, could take to the air as a bat and fire off the spread attack. Allies could be traded for new ones met on the journey and taken all the way up to the final boss encounter. Castlevania III was a successful fusion of the first two games. It recaptured the linear simplicity of the first, while adding that dash of creative variety to each playthrough that Simon's Quest failed to provide. Interestingly, while many NES games from Japan were being heavily censored in the US, many of the religious images in Dracula's Curse went untouched. Only a few nude statues were covered up, and some gameplay tweaks were made that made the game tougher. It's often the other way around. Project 51 Productions obtained the rights to produce a direct DVD animated feature based on the story of Dracula's Curse, but as of now, the project is on hold. Castlevania didn't reach the phenomenal sales numbers of other NES legends like Zelda and Metroid, or even financially surpass other horror franchises like Ghosts and Goblins while on the 8-bit console. But this new series did set forth a tradition of evil, led by an undead icon that could return an indefinite number of times, and no one would question why or how. The franchise would have to continue its metamorphosis, and Konami's League of Expert Vampire Hunters were ready for an even greater challenge. In Part 2 of the Castlevania retrospective, Dracula's domain is regrown in even greater resolution. The first game gets another honored retelling, the series tries to tie itself closer to Bram Stoker's novel, and the prodigal son composes a sweet, side-scrolling symphony. American audiences inherited Dracula's Curse just 2 months before the Super Famicom launched in Japan. Mario was the first icon out of the gate to promote the new system. NES veteran Simon Belmont would follow less than a year later on Halloween 1991, and in his quickest turnaround appear on the Super Nintendo only 2 months later. The Whipcracker breached the SNES before Samus, Kirby, Mega Man, and even Donkey Kong. Super Castlevania IV was less of a new chapter and more a nod to the first entry in the series. The controller gave Simon another button for his sub-weapon, and his arsenal mirrored that of Castlevania 1. The brand new Mode 7 graphics let the castle twist and rotate around the player, and their leaps got luckier with the ability to control Simon's fall after each perilous jump and swing from hanging hooks. The greatest achievement was the ability to snap the whip in 8 directions instead of 2. This meant bosses never cheated their way out of your reach, and Simon could slay enemies without moving a muscle. The whip, and the entire inventory for that matter, leveled up like before. The elements that weren't broken stayed classic, and Konami brought in baddies from Simon's Quest and Dracula's Curse to dwell in added environments leading up to the castle door. Masanori Adachi and Taro Kudo produced the score, composing new tracks and remixing old ones. The endemic themes they revisited would become expected by fans in future installments, no matter which Belmont was chosen. It was this nostalgia that fueled what would become the last in the series to be named numerically. Like the quests that came before it, Castlevania IV did not sell over 1 million units and is not considered one of the Super Nintendo's best-selling games. It is considered one of the best in the series, however, and a fitting tribute to the original. With a new generation beckoning, the saga story would finally move forward on another console. The PC Engine, which ironically launched on Halloween in 1987, was the first game system with an optional CD-based peripheral. It was upgraded to combat the rocketing popularity of the Super Famicom in Japan. The same year Bonk 3 and Street Fighter II joined its library, Konami chose to put a new spin on their Demon Castle series with a brand new Belmont. The PC Engine in America was called the TurboGrafx 16. Castlevania Rondo of Blood hit stores 2 days before Halloween in 1993. The title is directly translated as Ren, a Japanese term for the Buddhist rotation of death and rebirth. A rondo is a musical form that is often referencing a return to a particular theme or motif. It was the first installment with a 3-word subtitle, a naming convention that would become a series tradition. The newest Belmont was named Richter, and he entered Castlevania not solely to overthrow Dracula, but also to rescue his girlfriend and 3 other captives. The first of these, Maria Renard, joined Richter for the duration. The 12-year-old mage harnessed the power of the animal kingdom to attack and defend, not to mention a life-saving double jump, and the player could swap freely between the 2 heroes. Rondo also added a villain to the fold, a dark priest named Shaft, who resurrected classic bosses and orchestrated the Master of the Estate's return. These stage-ending monsters were a bit feistier than before, often getting in one last shot after their life bar hit rock bottom. Richter inherited his father's equipment, but could also pick up a copy of the Good Book that would swirl around him as an offensive shield. Along with the standard sub-weapons, players could also unleash an item crash, which gave each weapon a heavier attack at the expense of additional hearts. The path to Dracula's Tower crossed 9 stages, with 4 extra hidden areas. There were no overworld map transitions and no whip upgrades. The whip on the first screen was the whip Richter took into the last fight. Rondo of Blood won the award for the best Japanese action game of 1994 by Electronic Gaming Monthly, and is considered a major turning point for the franchise. Anime had no doubt inspired Castlevania's design, but for the first time these illustrations were used to tell the story cinematically. The style, combined with the CD format's access to recorded dialogue, made the story resonate more than the Belmont's pixelated past.
君は先に村に戻れ。俺はこれからこの先へ進む。
The US market expected to miss out on the 10th title in the series, but a port called Dracula X was shipped over in September of 1995. Unfortunately, it ended up being less than expected. On its own, Dracula X was a solid game, reflective of what the US had grown to love about Castlevania. But anyone who had rondoed with Richter 1 year earlier knew what this new entry lacked compared to the original. Maria was removed as a playable character, the hidden levels mysteriously dropped from 4 to 2, and familiar zones were given an unwarranted remodel. Konami took a second stab at the port in 2007 with the Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP. This time they started from scratch, throwing Maria back in and drawing the castle and the cutscenes with 3D polygons. Anyone unfamiliar with this chapter in the timeline could also unlock a faithful copy of the PC Engine original, along with the game's smash hit PS1 sequel. Gamers could also rediscover the hidden classic on the Wii's Virtual Console in April of 2008. Those who chose to oppose Dracula via their Super Nintendo were still waiting on Dracula X when the Sega Genesis received their first and only Castlevania game. Bloodlines launched in all regions in May of 1994. It received a GA from Sega's own Video Game Rating Council, which would shut its doors later the same year. Although dubbed appropriate for all ages, it stands as one of the goriest games in the franchise. Super Street Fighter II and Wing Commander, on the other hand, were intended for mature audiences only. The title screen offered 2 Slayers to choose from, unlike previous adventures that posted them at predetermined spots along the path. John Morris was the chosen Belmont, instructed in the ways of the whip, including the ability to swing from the ceiling. And Eric Lecard was a master lanceman with a high jump and a thirst for vengeance after his love was turned into a blood-sucking beast. While the game was as linear as ever, it traveled far beyond the castle walls and even the borders of Romania. Chasing the niece of Count Dracula, Elizabeth Bartley, and her follower, the witch Drolta Zuentes, players visited a shrine to the lost city of Atlantis in Greece, the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy, a retired munitions factory in Germany, the Versailles Palace in France, and the fictional Castle Proserpina in England. The villainesses were indirect references to real-life Gothic figures Ursabet Bathory and Dorothea Sentes, and the opening subtly suggests they ordered the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an event which is believed to have sparked World War I. Even more perplexing were supposed ties to Bram Stoker's novel. John Morris was identified as the son of Quincy Morris, referred to as an indirect descendant of the Belmont clan. Quincy was the Texan who bested the Count at the cost of his own life in the book's finale. Bloodlines built a new audience for Castlevania on a new console. When the system was stacked with the 32X and CD add-ons, Konami sought to bring Richter and Maria back. They commissioned Koji Igarashi, a programmer for Daytona Twinbee and Gradius 2, to direct the sequel. Bloodlines composer Mishiro Yamane was attached to compose the score, and Ayami Kojima began producing elaborate illustrations to realize the characters. The game was never named because it was never finished, although fans have dubbed the Phantom Project the Bloodletting. Konami moved the team to Sony's PlayStation 1. It's rumored that much of the work they had already finished went with them. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was released on March 20th, 1997. The US sank their teeth into it 7 months later. Dracula's Black Sheep Alucard was the main playable character. Richter could be unlocked after the game was completed and started the game via a flashback to Rondo of Blood that was incorrectly labeled Bloodlines. The conditions of this first battle, such as damage taken and items used, affected Alucard's stats when players later assumed control of the brooding vampire. Aside from a quick stroll through the bordering forest, the game took place entirely inside Dracula's castle. Players could quickly bring up the map and chart their progress. Other than an inaccessible ledge or locked door, the whole of the fortress was theirs to explore, with major areas separated by uniform loading hallways. The series borrowed the format from another popular Nintendo original, leaving fans of both to question whether Symphony of the Night was more Castleroid or Metroidvania. The free-roaming map was a breakthrough and the first in a cornucopia of gameplay improvements. Alucard now gained experience points and levels, increasing his strength or dexterity, could acquire new abilities like swimming and double jumping, shapeshift into a bat or wolf or misty cloud, discover or purchase new equipment to wear and wield, and recruit several familiars to tag along, including a fairy, demon, ghost, bat, and sword.
This switch hasn't been pressed yet.
A quick backdash pulled Alucard out of danger, expendable weapons could be used one time for increased damage or range, potions or food cured curses and helped resist certain elements, and special button combinations triggered a cache of magical spells. The game was so deep that a third of the content was almost hidden. All roads led to a climax with Richter Belmont in the Count's throne room, and Alucard could strike down the former hero, queuing up an end cinema and credits. But if you met up with Maria beforehand, Alucard could see a green orb circling the hunter and discover that Richter was being possessed by the enigmatic Shaft. This opened a portal traveling above the clouds to an upside-down version of the entire castle, with new monsters, bosses, and plot twists to uncover. About the only thing fans found fault in was the overall difficulty, and not in the way they were used to. With the ability to make Alucard superpowered through leveling, some veterans found the game a cakewalk, even when exclusively using the first weapon they were given. None of the easiness detracted from the awesomeness, however, and Konami worked up a port of Symphony for Sega in June of 1998. The Saturn version had 2 new sections, along with more music, enemies, bosses, and items. In 2007, it reappeared on Xbox Live Arcade, the PlayStation Network, and hidden within Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP. Symphony of the Night was the most drastically improved game in the series. No single game in the franchise had received the amount of new features that Igarashi and team found room for on the PS1. It stubbornly stayed 2D when every franchise in the industry was scrambling for a way to make that extra dimension work, proving a series can stay true to itself while still blowing players' minds. Like its brethren, it was cursed into obscurity, again failing to climb sales charts and rest among the most lucrative games on the system. But it did garner a ferocious fan following, dare anyone to remove it from a top 100 games list, and write the blueprint for how the series should, and eventually would, continue. After sticking to the Famicom for 3 years, Castlevania spent the better part of the 90s taking big risks on new consoles. Almost every platform got an exclusive entry, and word of this bloodthirsty franchise began to reach players that might have missed its 8-bit era entirely. By the time Symphony played its masterful melody, no one could deny the series' brilliance simply because it was too difficult. Could the series reinvent itself even further? In Part 3 of the Castlevania retrospective, the Belmonts enter unfamiliar territory as Konami struggles to find a place for their House of Horrors in a new 3D generation. New projects rise and fall, the Nintendo 64 witnesses some of Castlevania's darkest days, and a lament of lore sets the series straight from the very beginning. Symphony of the Night granted the Castlevania franchise a hefty amount of credibility, but it also delayed the inevitable. In 1997, the Third Dimension took hold of the industry with releases like Mario Kart, Star Fox, GoldenEye, Quake 2, Gran Turismo, and Final Fantasy VII. It was this year Konami put its Kobe team on the next Castlevania game, nicknamed Dracula 3D. It would launch on the Nintendo 64, and it was the first game in 13 years to be simply called Castlevania. Castlevania 64 was released on January 26, 1999 in America. This time, Japan had to wait 3 months. It was subtitled Apocalypse overseas. The development team originally planned to include 4 characters, but deadlines later forced them to remove 2. One of these canceled Crusaders, named Collar, had his elements appropriately reused for a Frankenstein-esque boss called the Gardener. The remaining heroes were Reinhard Schneider, a Belmont heir, and Carrie Fernandez, a magically gifted orphan. Both characters were picked at the outset and could not be swapped along the journey. Each had to march through 10 areas to reach the finale. 7 were shared and 3 were exclusive to each character, making 13 levels total. The librarian from Symphony became Renan, an enterprising vendor who also happened to be a demon. If you spent over 30,000 gold, he would lay claim to your soul and challenge you in battle just before the final string of boss encounters. Reinhardt fought with a whip and dagger, and Carrie could charge her spells with throw metal rings. Only 4 sub-weapons made the cut, now powered by red jewels instead of red hearts. The gameplay also added options for camera control, normal, battle, and action. The perspective could be snapped into place with the R button, and certain bosses locked the camera intentionally. Today it's hard for most fans to take the visuals in Castlevania 64 seriously, but initially, the game received mostly favorable reviews. Criticisms were focused on the spastic camera, slow character movement, and inconsistent controls. But considering it was Konami Kobe's first 3D project, it was to be expected. They did pull Dracula's domicile off a flat surface, bringing the oppressive atmosphere to life. The elements that were either cut or rushed to make the release date were saved for a sequel. Using these assets as a launchpad, they were able to turn around the next installment the same year. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was released on November 30th in America and on Christmas Day in Japan. The Japanese title is the longest in the series, Demon Castle Dracula Apocalypse Gaiden Legend of Cornell. The protagonist, a wolfman nicknamed Blue Crescent Moon, was the other fallen playable character from the first N64 game. The press of a button brought on his transformation, increasing speed and damage but irreversibly draining the entire jewel count. Although Legacy started with Cornell's tale, a mission to recover his sister Ada from the clutches of Guess Who, the game is officially referred to as a special edition of, and prequel to, the original, and included many of the same zones, along with the option to unlock and play as Reinhardt and Carrie in new costumes and against new bosses. Finishing Cornell's quest started another, led by Holy Knight Henry Oldry. The honorable warrior had to rescue 6 children during his campaign, with each youngster unlocking more bonus content. He shared many of Cornell's powers, but carried a sidearm that could take care of business from long range. The added journeys explored new areas and revisited old haunts, altering an old level's appearance or having you cross it from another direction. Cornell's curse took a cue from Simon's quest, with certain events only happening when the sun or moon was above. Hearing complaints from fans, the camera and combat controls were streamlined. The improved visuals leaned on the Nintendo 64's expansion pack, but many reported the optional mode's performance to be inconsistent. The 2 Nintendo 64 Castlevania games are not what you would call cherished by the series community, and most of this can be blamed on soaring expectations, along with some punishing platforming. Symphony of the Night in 3D sounded spectacular, but director Yuji Shibata's team had to settle on something between Tomb Raider and Nightmare Creatures. Their interpretation was authentic, with a look and feel that projected Castlevania's undertones, but the experience had to move faster if it was to keep up with the pace of Rondo or Symphony, not to mention the rapidly expanding 3D market. Eager to join any new console's library, Konami slated Castlevania to beguile the Sega Dreamcast even before Legacy of Darkness was finished. Castlevania Resurrection was first delayed in June of 1999, again in September of 2000, and put on indefinite hold in March of 2001, the same month the series first appeared on the Game Boy Advance. Production never restarted despite the game being seen at E3 via full motion video and a batch of promising screenshots. Development problems were later attributed to disagreements between the Japanese and American teams, along with the looming demise of the Dreamcast. It was the farthest a Castlevania game had traveled through development before getting canned. Fans amused themselves by calling it Canceledvania. With 3D plans on hold, the series stayed relevant on the GBA, using Symphony's model to satiate their fans on the go. Koji Igarashi had kept himself busy refining his console experiment on handhelds and creating new memorable characters. With the Dreamcast dead and the PS2 looming over its grave, Koji got his crew back together, including composer Michiru Yamane and illustrator Ayami Kojima, and set out to bring back that old familiar feeling. With 4 years having passed since faithful slayers could destroy evil with an analog stick, Konami wasn't interested in just another sequel. The next installment would have to be memorable. Castlevania Lament of Innocence was released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 on October 21st, 2003 in North America and November 27th in Japan. Seeing as the story was set in 1094, Igarashi made it clear that this was the beginning of the Belmont saga. The greatest of Simon's grandfathers was named Leon Belmont, and like his descendants, he took on the undead forces to recover a lost love named Sarah. His friend Matthias Kronkfist warned him of the vampire Walter Bernard's sinister kidnapping, forcing Leon to seek the aid of Ronaldo Gandolfi, an alchemist living dangerously close to the castle's borders. Most vendors in Castlevania traded wares somewhere within the grounds, but Ronaldo offered his services before Leon's trial even began. He reluctantly told the Belmont about his newfound mythical whip called the Vampire Killer, that could reach the full potential its name suggested with a powerful act of sacrifice. Other elemental whips dropped off their corresponding bosses in optional fights, placing the skull-cracking weapon at the forefront once again. This was supplemented by sub-weapons, combos, and magical abilities. Sub-weapons could be crossed with one of 7 colored orbs to vary their effects, multiplying the different ways you could use them. For the first time, a Belmont could block and perform a duo of evasive maneuvers. Defeating Bernard, followed by death and finishing the game, unlocked 2 additional characters, Joachim Armster, one of the earlier bosses, and Pumpkin, a precocious trick-or-treater. Crazy Mode was also available after completion for the sadists, along with all skills mode for those who wanted to try out all of Leon's moves. Rather than looping around in circles or being tracked along an endless hallway, the 6 central divisions of the game could be reached from a central hub, letting players chart their progress. Unlike the 64 entries, which set hunters astray with no map to follow, Lament's gridlock of corridors and crevices was charted in a top-down screen that could be marked in various colors. The only thing missing was camera control. The right analog stick opened an equipment window instead, which served as the only method for wearing or using items. Lament of Innocence reminded Konami and its followers that Castlevania was all about action, even if it did flagrantly borrow elements from brawling shooters like Devil May Cry. There were a few touchy whip vaulting sections, but most rooms were cleared when every spawning monster turned to dust. While producing his first DS game for the franchise, Iga also supervised a sequel and kept the same clan of creative minds working to improve the formula. They jumped from the beginning of the timeline to 3 years after the third NES game, Dracula's Curse. A Belmont would once again become an adversary, and the new Slayer would have to make a deal with some devils. Castlevania Curse of Darkness arrived on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox on November 5th, 2005. Japan got the curse later the same month. Blazing a trail for Alucard to follow, the hero without a last name, Hector, left the employ of the perpetual Prince of Darkness days before Trevor Belmont did his duty. Although trying to pursue a normal life, Hector's fiancée was accused of being a witch and burned at the stake. Hector's old colleague Isaac claimed it was Hector that led to Dracula's fall and tried to rewrite all wrongs by calling Hector back home. Hector and Isaac were Devil Forge masters, or summoners of facilitating familiars. Hector could adopt and breed 6 different types of innocent devils, aka IDs: Fairy, Battle, Bird, Mage, Devil, and of course, Pumpkin. They could level up along with Hector and evolve into more useful forms depending on the weapon Hector used and grinding their experience. Julia introduced herself before too long as the game's vendor, supplying one-time weapons and ingredients for the forging trade. Since Hector was also not a Belmont, he could take his pick among a selection of blade types. Switching among the 5 brands of implements changed Hector's combos and fighting animations. This arsenal, along with stealing items from enemies, chaining attacks, and deflecting with a perfect guard, brought life to the continual trek through the game's zones. Finally banishing Dracula's curse unlocked modes in a playable Trevor Belmont. Crazy players could endure Crazy Mode again, and a boss rush option became available at each warp room. Curse of Darkness took in scores equivalent to every 3D Castlevania game before it. The map layouts hadn't changed drastically since Lament, but the combat had a feel all its own, with evolving pets that kept the player company in the imposing claustrophobic areas. In 2005, a 2-volume manga adaptation of the same name premiered in Japan and was translated into English starting in 2008. Like Dracula rising from the grave when a prophecy is fulfilled, Konami kept taking a crack at 3D with 2 teams, each producing 2 games that had to represent more than a decade of side-scrolling from any and all angles. Their success varies depending on who you ask. Some Castlevania fans would say the Nintendo 64 outings were faithful to the franchise, and that Lament and Curse offered more combat variety than any handheld could store. Others would begrudge the series for copying other popular 3D games instead of devil forging its own unique experience, especially given how unique the franchise was on the NES. If they got one thing right, it was that Castlevania can sometimes be unforgiving. Only the patient persevere. In Part 4 of the Castlevania Retrospective, Slayers can fit the whole of the castle in the palm of their hand. Nintendo, Castlevania, and a charged-up battery have shared a special relationship. Small sequels light up in black and white, advanced adventures introduce new faces, and a sorrowful sorcerer leads the transition to dual-screen slaying. By the late 1980s, players had overcome 2 grueling quests into the dominion of the sinister Count Dracula. The second was made mobile by Tiger Electronics in December of 1988, 4 months before Nintendo was set to claim the handheld world by delivering games in separate cartridges. The Game Boy landed in April of '89. It would sell 1 million units a week after showing up in the US 2 months later. Along with launch standards such as Super Mario Land and Tetris, the Game Boy featured a number of NES fan faves like Double Dragon and Final Fantasy. But before the Game Boy would come to meet the likes of legends such as Pit, Samus, or even Link, there would be a Belmont. Castlevania: The Adventure was released in Japan just before Halloween in 1989, and in the US at Christmas. The adventure was known in Japan as Dracula Densetsu, or The Legend of Dracula. It was the first prequel in the series, set a century before the events in the original Castlevania. The story focused on Christopher Belmont, an ancestor of Simon. Although not noted in the US release, Christopher already existed in the lore of Castlevania and was mentioned as the last Belmont to have defeated Dracula before Simon in the original Japanese manual. When compared to Castlevania and Simon's Quest, the adventure had much simpler gameplay. Hearts replaced health, and there were neither sub-weapons to manage nor stairs to climb. There were only 4 stages, and Christopher only had 3 lives, after which the game ended. He could gain extra lives by accruing points. While most of the gameplay variations served to streamline the complexity, a timer was added to keep the player moving. Although the resulting game was a less dynamic Castlevania, the adventure served its purpose in the early age of portability, where quick, basic games were the norm. More technically advanced systems sprouted up, like the NEC's Turbo Express and Sega's Game Gear, but after crushing Atari's Lynx, Nintendo still had the generational lead. Adventure's sequel would do just fine in black and white. In 1991, Christopher Belmont returned for Castlevania II. Its Japanese counterpart Dracula Densetsu 2 was released in July, while Belmont's Revenge hit the US in August. 15 years after the adventure, Dracula captured Christopher's son, Soleil. Using the boy's powers, Dracula was able to regain human form and rebuild his empire from stone and dirt. This time, Christopher had a little more help. He was able to use holy water or axes as sub-weapons, and a password system saved his progress. Initially, Christopher was able to choose from 4 different levels. Each zone was based on a different elemental theme: plant, cloud, rock, and crystal. The 4 could be attempted in any order, and their completion exposed Dracula's castle, revealing a drawbridge to Christopher's destiny. Christopher's adventures may have ended with Belmont's Revenge, but they would be retold again. Both would be included in the Konami Game Boy Collection compilations. The adventure appeared in Volume 1, while Belmont's Revenge wasn't released until Volume 4. The adventure also received a recent update in 2009 in the form of a WiiWare reinvention Rebirth, featuring 2 extra levels and the use of sub-weapons. The Game Boy would not bear a Belmont for 6 more years, but the little system was revisited by the Count in 1993. In stark contrast to the gothic luster of art like Kojima's, Kid Dracula was meant to be whimsical rather than horrific. It was a sequel to Akumajo's special Boku Dracula-kun, which only saw daylight in Japan 2 years earlier. After waking from a long slumber, the pale and pudgy kid discovered the lumbering beast Garamoth had challenged him. Kid Dracula certainly didn't stand for that, and challenged Garamoth right back. Among multiple later cameos, Garamoth, renamed Galamoth in an ongoing Japanese-English translation variation, appeared as a boss near the top of the inverted castle in Symphony of the Night. Even after the PS1 behemoth ushered in a new era, the Game Boy still retained its simplistic button configuration and monochromatic color scheme. Near the end of the 20th century, a woman picked up the Vampire Killer Whip for the first time. Although the US received Castlevania Legends in 1998, the game was released the prior year in Japan as Demon Castle Dracula Dark Knight Prelude. Legends rewound to the origin of the Belmont's grudge against Dracula, which Lamented Innocence would write over 5 years later. On her travels, Sonia encountered Alucard, not surprising given his symphony was sung months earlier, and was forced to duel with Dracula's rebellious heir. Sonia eventually would have a child, who would also grow up to fight Dracula. Considering that 8 years had passed, the differences between Legends and Adventure were not substantial. Sonia had 3 lives, like Christopher, but could restart the stage she was on after dying. Sub-weapons became soul weapons in the form of fire, ice, wind, saint, and magic. One addition was that Sonia could enter a powered-up burning mode once per life or level. With only slight improvements, Sonia's saga was soon forgotten. In addition to being retconned out of lore, Sonia also suffered the crushing defeat of being one of the major characters in the horribly misnamed Castlevania Resurrection. Igarashi was quoted as saying Legends was something of an embarrassment for the series. Legends didn't do much its predecessors hadn't, but that could also be blamed on the evolutionarily stubborn Game Boy that took 9 years to go color and another 3 to upgrade its hardware entirely. In 2001, Nintendo unleashed the 32-bit 512-color Game Boy Advance. The powerhouse portable kicked off its library with recognizable brand names including F-Zero Maximum Velocity, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Earthworm Jim, and Castlevania: Circle of the Moon. Much like the N64 series, Circle of the Moon featured no Belmonts. Instead, the orphan Nathan Graves was the playable character. After his parents were slaughtered in an attempt to destroy Dracula, a man named Boris Baldwin trained Nathan, along with his own son Hugh, to be an expert vampire hunter. 10 years later, a disciple of Dracula named Camilla attempted to revive her master. Camilla was most likely based on the title character of Sheridan Le Fanu's gothic novel Carmilla, who is also referenced as the boss of Laruba Mansion in Simon's Quest. The hunt for Dracula charted the castle map and crossed into another dimension. Camilla's cataclysm separated the pupils from their master, and the two repeatedly found and eventually fought each other in their struggle to bring Morris back. Circle of the Moon adopted the 4-year-old Metroid map procedure. Nathan leveled up similarly to Alucard, and slaying bosses granted new abilities. Nathan could also utilize the dual setup system, or DSS, which joined 2 cards that had different attributes on them into one outcome. There were 20 different cards to mix and match, allowing for dozens of combinations. Nathan could possess a variety of sub-weapons, unlike many previous Porta-Belmonts, and all the Castlevania classics were present. In addition, Nathan had various stats he could raise as he leveled that affected different aspects of his character. The Battle Arena added another challenge as well as different modes that activated each other. Magician mode led to fighter mode and so on, and each new option stressed a certain aspect of gameplay and diminished others. The first GBA Castlevania did what its forefathers could not: sell over 1 million copies. Despite the game's warm reception, Igarashi was again displeased with certain aspects of this portable addition to the canon. Circle of the Moon was eventually erased from the timeline in 2002. Although Igarashi cited the game's inception as a standalone title as the reason for its removal, Nathan reluctantly joined Sonia on the cutting room floor. To steer the series back on course, Igarashi assumed control of production to assure the next entry would be accepted in the timeline. Harmony of Dissonance, or Concerto of the Midnight Sun in Japan, featured the grandson of Simon Belmont, Just. Set 50 years after Castlevania 3, Just and his friend Maxim set out to rescue their friend Liddy, trapped like so many before her in a formidable castle. Just was forced to leave the wounded Maxim but rediscovered him, like Nathan finding his pal Hugh on several occasions. Just eventually realized he was trapped within 2 versions of the same castle, and the projections were powered by the 2 aspects of Maxim's mind. Harmony of Dissonance was Symphony of the Night, with different sub-weapons and no familiars. Just wielded the Belmont's family heirloom, the Vampire Killer, and collected upgrades for it instead. Unlike Symphony, the split worlds reacted to each other. Destroying one area might affect the opposite block of the map. The castle also held a room Just could decorate purely for his own amusement. Fans and critics loved Harmony of Dissonance but hated its score, which some publications felt comprised the worst of Castlevania's songs. Igarashi did not consider Harmony a hit, but admitted the music was sacrificed for the sake of the graphics. Since the eye-catching visuals were a high point of praise, the game's supporters believe it was a wise choice. While Harmony of Dissonance was in development, Iga was also overseeing a third GBA game. The sibling project shared many of Harmony's elements and ran on the same engine, so the team kept it fresh by fast-forwarding to the year 2035 and moving from Transylvania to Japan. Michiru Yamane helped the series recover from Harmony's lukewarm audio with her third franchise composition. Released within days of each other in both Japan and the US, Aria of Sorrow and its Japanese counterpart Minuet of Dawn appeared on shelves in May of 2003. Aria's hero was Soma Cruz, a transfer student studying in Japan and visiting his friend Mina. On the night of an eclipse, the two were drawn via a mysterious rift to Castlevania. Upon entering the grounds, the pair was greeted by an incognito Alucard who explained that Soma possessed mystical powers that allowed him to absorb the strengths of monsters. Naturally, Soma reluctantly set off through the castle, encountering a number of characters such as Yoko Bellmaids of the Dracula's Curse Bellmaidses, an army vet turned vendor named Hammer, and Julius Belmont, who last destroyed and sealed away Dracula in 1999. The fanatical Graham Jones believed he was the vessel of Dracula's return, forcing Soma to strike Graham down and inherit his curse. Soma disappeared into the Chaos Realm as Julius vowed to follow him and destroy the evil within. The most notable change to Iga's machine was the addition of Soma's tactical soul system. Soma could store up to 4 different types of souls: Bullet, Guardian, Enchant, and Ability. Only one Bullet, Guardian, or Enchant soul could be active at any given time. Bullet souls were support abilities like sub-weapons, and Guardian souls were temporary bonuses like summoning familiars. Both types consumed MP when active. Enchant souls provided a bonus as long as they were equipped. The key to the puzzles and challenges often involved the application of the different tactical souls. Aria was padded out with Hard Mode and Julius Mode, in which you played as Julius Belmont. Aria of Sorrow was given a nomination for GBA Game of the Year and high marks from other publications that had criticized the shortcomings of the series on handhelds. It enjoyed the best reviews and suffered the worst sales of the Castlevania titles on the Game Boy Advance. When Nintendo's handheld technology was ready for version 5.0, Castlevania had overcome its 3D growing pains. 3D handheld graphics were also becoming a reality, but eager to revisit the tactical soul system and the story of Soma Cruz, Igarashi wanted to stick to scrolling sideways. The GBA bowed down to the Nintendo DS in the fall of 2004. For the first time in Nintendo's portable history, Castlevania would not be there for its launch. Dawn of Sorrow, or Cross of the Blue Moon in Japan, was released in late 2005 and compounded on the structure of the first game. Soma still had soul, although Guardian familiars could now be directed with the stylus, and Yoko Bellmaids offered to upgrade your weapons via soul fusion. A magic seal system, capitalizing on the new touchscreen support, flashed illuminated symbols during boss battles, and the player had to trace the design. Dawn of Sorrow also contained a Julius mode, which along with the returning Belmont made Yoko Bellmaids and Alucard playable, a grouping reminiscent of Trevor, Sifa, and Alucard from Castlevania 3. The story centered on a cult led by Celia Fortner that was bent on bringing the Dark Lord back by destroying Soma. 2 of Celia's lackeys, Dimitri and Dario, were candidates for receiving Dracula's soul when it was released. Not wanting much more to do with Dark Lords, Soma set out with Julius, Yoko, Hammer, and Alucard to destroy the cult. After defeating the cult and destroying a foul collection of souls known as Menace, Soma was once again left to ponder his looming fate. Dawn of Sorrow made reviewers happy enough to give it an A average, and within weeks it sold into the hundreds of thousands. Seeking more cues from the classics, Iga recalled the character swapping in Dracula's Curse and the modern conflict of bloodlines to open up another portal in the timeline. Portrait of Ruin, or Gallery of Labyrinth in Japan, was released on December 5th, 2006 in the US. Gameplay required both playable characters, Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Allen, to alternate back and forth. Some challenges warranted the use of Dual Crush, in which both Slayers combined their powers to form different attacks. Portrait also featured multiple endings and modes. Much like Symphony of the Night, meeting requirements and making choices allowed the player to explore more of the castle. After attaining the best ending possible, players could unlock a prologue to Jonathan and Charlotte's story. In Sisters mode, you played as Loretta and Stella Lacard, daughters of Eric Lacard, from the Genesis exclusive. Boss Rush mode, Old Axe Armor mode, and Richter mode, in which the player controlled Richter and Maria, rounded out the extras. Portrait of Ruin also utilized the Nintendo DS's Wi-Fi feature and included cooperative multiplayer. Going online allowed players to buy items from each other and lend help in Boss Rush. Storyline featured Jonathan, the son of John Morris from Castlevania Bloodlines, and Charlotte, a member of the Belnades Order of Mages, and was set in 1944. The vampiric villain was based on and named after real-life surrealist artist Victor Bronner, who would have been alive and well during the 40s as he died in 1966. Bronner raised Castlevania by calling forth the spirits of those who died in World War II. Within the castle walls, Bronner had constructed mystical paintings that functioned as doorways to other parts of the world. With the help of the priest Vincent Doran, who sold Jonathan and Charlotte items, and the ghost of Eric Lacard, who trained their abilities and gave them quests, the duo defeated Bronner and prevented Dracula from escaping. Portrait of Ruin was a slight shift from Dawn of Sorrow. Players leapt from painting to explore locales like London and Egypt. The gameplay relied less on the touchscreen and more on Wi-Fi. Portrait of Ruin was another DS success. The game's music, assisted by ActRaiser and Shenmue composer Yuzo Koshiro, won an award for Best Original Score. One year later, PSP owners were treated to the 3 games in 1 Dracula X Chronicles, and stylus vets heard rumors Igarashi's entire team had directly moved onto a 3rd DS game. It would take place in the 1800s, shortly after the passing of Richter Belmont. As the clan diminished, a number of secret societies formed to study and prevent the return of Dracula. Among them was the Order of Ecclesia. The 3rd Castlevania game designed for the DS was released in October of 2008. In Japan, it was known as the Stolen Seal. Jumping back to a more traditional part of the timeline, players controlled Shinoa, one of the Order's disciples. She was chosen by the Order's patron Barlow, who might be a reference to the vampire in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, to receive the spirit of the Dominus through the magics of powerful glyphs. During the ritual, the glyphs were stolen by a colleague of Shinoa's, and with the transference incomplete, Shinoa was left with no memory or emotion. Order of Ecclesia added more layers of growth to the system. Even more RPG ingredients were included, some first touched on as far back as Simon's Quest. 20 different locations were available for Shinoa to explore, and an overworld connected them all. Quests provided Shinoa with various rewards. Being a member of the Order, Shinoa was able to use their powerful glyphs to unleash devastating magic. These symbols could be equipped or combined in a glyph union to generate various effects. When activated, glyphs ate away MP. If used in a glyph union, they consumed hearts instead. Much like its predecessors, completing the game unlocked goodies such as Boss Rush, Sound Test, and Hard Mode. One extra feature, Albus Mode, allowed the player to embark on the quest of Shinoa's glyph-stealing friend. In addition to online features similar to Portrait of Ruin, Order of Ecclesia also supported DS to Wii connectivity. When linking to the fighting spin-off Judgment, new content could be unlocked for both games. Order of Ecclesia took in the most awards of any handheld Castlevania. GameTrailers.com gave it the trophy for Best Nintendo DS Game of 2008. Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo DS each received 3 unique Castlevania games. Konami tried to reach out to mobile users with Order of Shadows in 2007, but the game scored poorly. The ideals dreamt up by Castlevania's console pillars were evolved and articulated in these installments, and some of them sold better than the games that started the whole series. The franchise today owes a great deal to their collective accomplishments. Half of the Castlevania franchise, 15 games total, were released for these various handhelds. Keeping a steady pace is the survival instinct of any good vampire hunter. It's no surprise the Castlevania fans like to stay on the go. Part 5, the final chapter of our Castlevania retrospective. We'll follow the blood trail through time and see it run over stories first forgotten and later reclaimed. Timelines clash as the lines of lineage and lore are drawn. The world of Castlevania is clearly fictional, but many of its characters are based on real people. Bram Stoker and Konami both took the name of the Prince of Wallachia, Dracula, aka Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was born in Transylvania, the central region of Romania, and had his own digs called Poinar Castle. Its location near the northeast forests of the Carpathian Mountains inspired the book, films, and games. Villains and heroes, both fictional and historical, have entered Castlevania, so to know its history of spoofs and tributes is to understand both sides. A Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess rumored to have tortured and killed hundreds of young women. Elizabeth Bartley, her alter ego, was executed for vampirism in the early 1600s, which would line up perfectly with Bathory's death in 1614. Gilles de Rais was a Bretonite, not to mention a compatriot of Joan of Arc, a powerful military tactician, and a schizophrenic madman whose exploits named him as a vicious werewolf. Bram Stoker himself included an acknowledgement to Sheridan Le Fanu, the creator of Carmilla Karnstein, in his foreword to Dracula. Dagon was a version of one of H.P. Lovecraft's old ones. The Comte de Saint-Germain of Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's series of novels that began in the late 1970s echoed the foppish boss in Curse of Darkness. And although the Golem is a facet of Hebrew mythology, it was Gustav Meyrink novel in 1914 that mirrored Shelley's horrific themes in Frankenstein. Mythology filled in the gaps, the majority of which was Greek, inspiring minotaurs, chimera, manticores, the three-headed guardian of the underworld Cerberus, and the Gorgon queen Medusa. Balkan myth inspired the Rusalka in order of Ecclesia, and Celtic myth produced the Balor. Biblical and Hebrew mythology brought Abaddon and Beelzebub to the castle, and ancient Assyrian and Babylonian gods made an appearance in the forms of Adramelech and Pazuzu. This is where the truth ends and Konami's fiction begins. In 2002, preceding the release of Harmony of Dissonance, Konami posted a timeline on the GBA Games official website. Fans noticed several events were intentionally cut, including Legends, Circle of the Moon, Legacy of Darkness, and Castlevania 64. 3 years later, Konami accepted a few back into the Castlevania Extreme Desktop timeline, and in 2006, bonus material with Portrait of Ruin added all the titles officially, except for Legends. While there is heavy contention as to which order of events is correct, all the games were given a year or era, so stacking them isn't the issue. The difficult part comes in figuring out the complete list Konami actually intended. 17 games make up the core history of Castlevania, a tale that's been reset by the latest release, Lords of Shadow. As that era begins, the time has come to put this one to rest. According to lore, the first Belmont to begin the crusade was Leon. Leon entered the Forest of Eternal Night to recover his love Sarah and investigate waves of monsters spilling out of the area. In the castle of Walter Bernhard, Leon endured his burden, unlocked the potential of a powerful family heirloom known as the Vampire Killer, and had a part in the transformation of his friend Matthias Kronqvist into the infamous Undead Lord. With the help of Death, Matthias used the ebony and crimson stones to exact revenge against God after his wife Elisabetha was taken from him. Although Leon defeated Death and vowed to hunt Dracula, the two never actually fought each other.
Mother!
That voice! Alucard, it's you!
Dracula married a second time to a woman named Lisa, but she would be convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake sometime in the 15th century. Konami sets the date as 1470, but this contrasts Alucard's age, suggested in Symphony of the Night. His non-canonical appearance in Legends puts Alucard's mother's death somewhere around the early 1400s, which most fans believe.
Alucard, you incompetent idiot! Out of my castle, you deadbeat!
Hey! You can't kick me out! I'll show you! You just wait and see!
The first Belmont to defeat the Prince of Darkness was Trevor. Despite rumors of the family's supernatural powers, Trevor was the first to actually reclaim the Vampire Killer. His journey began in 1476, the same year Dracula's real-life inspiration, Vlad Tepes, died. It is unclear as to whether or not Matthias Kronqvist was intended to correlate with the actual Wallachian nobleman. Trevor's story continued 3 years later in Curse of Darkness. The hero Hector's friend, Isaac, was used as a host for Dracula's spirit. Hector destroyed Death, Dracula, and his blight put upon the world. After Trevor's experiences in the castle, he settled down with companion Sifa Belnades and became the patron of both the Belmont and Belnades clans. Trevor's Japanese counterpart, Ralph Belmondo, clearly suffered the most variance in translation from Japanese to English, but his wife Sifa and her offspring would also share multiple identities. According to lore, Sifa was a female who had to disguise her gender in order to become a vampire hunter. However, due to a mistake in the original English manual for Dracula's Curse, Sifa was listed as male. This lasted for the early part of her Western career, which even led to a brief cameo in Captain N the Game Master as the incorrect gender. In the English version of Dracula's Curse, as well as subsequent games featuring the character's last name, Sifa's heritage was Isabelne's. However, according to the Japanese versions of the game, as well as Castlevania 64, the name is pronounced closer to Fernandez. Sifa's actual last name was intended to mimic a Romanian surname that neither Japanese nor English could articulate, and as a result, was lost in translation. This type of misnomer can also be seen with Sifa's adventuring companion, Grant Dynasty, who most logically intended to be named after the Dynasty, one of the two main lineages of Wallachia nobility. After Trevor, the Count seemed to return every century, barring the meddling of toadies like Shaft, Barlow, and Camilla. Christopher was described as being Trevor's successor, and was likely his grandson based on the passage of time. Christopher's adventure took place in 1576, exactly 100 years after Dracula's Curse. Order of Shadows and Resurrection, both considered outside the timeline, would take place decades later. Over a century passed when Christopher's descendant, Simon, stormed through the gates. Again, it's unclear as to Christopher's relation to Simon, although it's assumed that he was Simon's grandfather. It's also unclear as to whether Soleil, Christopher's son, was Simon's father or uncle. Simon Belmont, or Shimon Belmondo to the Japanese, had his exploits captured in Castlevania 1, 4, Chronicles, and Haunted Castle. Simon began his quest in 1691 and finally destroyed Dracula for a second time in 1698, leading up to the turn of the 18th century. The Count became more resilient following his defeat to Simon, returning from the dead to battle the Belmont every 50 or so years. The next Belmont to take up the vampire killer was Simon's grandson, Just. He was chosen to carry the heirloom in 1476 and engaged Castlevania 2 years later. Just's quest was probably the least heroic, as he was the first Belmont to almost accidentally encounter Dracula. Just's actual goal in Harmony of Dissonance was to rescue Liddy. Dracula just got in the way. While Just was actually documented as being Simon's grandson, the series returned to family ambiguity with his descendant, Richter. It is again assumed that Richter is Just's grandson, as this seemed to be the reoccurring theme. Richter's substantial stint in lore began in 1792, just under 50 years after Just. His first trial would be to rescue his girlfriend, Annette, along with Tara, Iris, and Maria. Richter and Maria were intended to come back 2 years later for the bloodletting, but instead reunited in 1797, when Richter's mind was captured and Alucard came knocking. In 2008, a radio drama was released giving the duo one last thrill that took place 1 year later. Richter would be the last Belmont to take up the vampire killer for a long time. For the next 200 years, the world would go without the Belmonts. For some reason, the house went into hibernation, leaving the slaying to family friends, the Morrises, who also had a personal grudge against the Count. Various secret societies also began to form, including the Order of Ecclesia. When Albus stole the glyphs in memory of Shinoa, he was actually preventing her sacrifice to Dominus, and ended up taking her place as she used it on Count Dracula. Betrayed by her master Barlow, Shinoa was left without a friend or a teacher. Morris Baldwin would carry the weight of Dracula's suppression after the Order, and with the parents of Nathan Graves, he sealed Dracula away in 1820. Ever the vigilant undead, Dracula was resurrected by Chaos Worshippers a decade later, forcing Morris's students to join the ongoing struggle. Like Albus, Hugh appeared the betrayer, but Nathan was able to save both student and master. 24 years later, while Nathan and Hugh were still conceivably alive, Dracula's slaves burned nearby villages and snatched up children including Ada, sister to the werewolf Cornell. Dracula teased the warrior's nemesis, Ortega, with the gift of greater power. Despite both enemies being destroyed by Cornell, Dracula re-emerged 8 years later. Reinhard Schneider and Carrie Fernandez first mistook the vampire Gilles de Rais for the castle's lord, but a young violin player named Malice turned out to be Dracula reborn. Dracula was published in May of 1897, and the actions of Jonathan Harker and Quincy Morris were added to the Castlevania legend to support the inclusion of Quincy's son, John. John crossed over most of Europe with his childhood friend Eric Leccard in 1914, avenging his fallen father and helping Eric find peace after the Countess Bartley made Eric's wife a vampire. But Eric's tragedy was just beginning, and 30 years later his daughters would be taken as well. Bloodline suggested the Countess was responsible for starting World War I, and Portrait of Ruin began with Dracula being trapped inside his own castle by Count Bronner as the world around him recovered from World War II. Jonathan Morris regretted not being able to stop Dracula with the vampire killer, but his father kept the knowledge from Jonathan to save him from being corrupted. Together with childhood friend Charlotte Allen, Jonathan stopped Dracula cold. Eric's daughters were returned to him in the good ending, and the Lanceman's spirit was set free. One last Belmont would questionably resurface towards the end of the 20th century. In the Suite of Sorrow, Julius was referred to as having defeated Dracula in a clash known as the Demon Castle War, which is yet to be realized in playable form. In the events of Aria of Sorrow, Julius recovered from amnesia caused by this fateful fight, and continued to challenge the Dark Lord by helping Soma Cruz suppress his powers. The last time Dracula was actually defeated in battle was by Julius Belmont in 1999. The next spawn of Dracula's soul was Soma Cruz, who discovered his powers and will be transported to Castlevania 25 years from now. Two cults would challenge Soma in 2 years, the first sparked by Graham Jones, and the second by Celia Fortner and her puppets Dimitri and Dario. With the help of his friends and the long-secluded Alucard pretending to be Genya Arikado, Soma was able to control his darker side despite these dual threats. Soma and Julius were able to part ways without destroying each other. This would be the end of the timeline if it weren't for 2009's Castlevania Judgment.
If you will fight, then stand resolute.
Set thousands of years in the future, the Time Watcher Aeon assembled 13 warriors to overcome the time-altering Garamoth and his messenger, the Time Reaper. Although it is considered canon, most of the events pertain to Judgment alone, despite including fighters from multiple eras. Some of the characters in Judgment might have met gamers in 2009 for the first time, given how long the series has survived and how many consoles it's corrupted over the years. As Slayers live and die, one of the only threads to tie the franchise together is the music. An astonishing 30 composers have worked on the series in its 24-year lifespan. Several tracks have appeared multiple times, and most players that know them by heart probably don't know what they're called. Vampire Killer was written for Castlevania 1. Bloody Tears for Simon's Quest. The Beginning for Dracula's Curse. Simon's Theme for Castlevania 4. And Bloodlines for Rondo of Blood. Even a remix of Alucard's theme from Symphony could be heard by putting the disc in a CD player, and multiple soundtrack collections have chronicled the collective work. A tribute concert dedicated entirely to the Castlevania series was held in Stockholm, Sweden on February 19, 2010. The concert was initiated by pianist David Westerlund and featured a guest performance by Michiru Yamane. There were virtually no orchestral arrangements written for these games, so many had to be created from scratch. more than 2 decades after the rusted gates of Castlevania first opened, the series fought for immortality by appearing in multiple mediums. In 2009, its evil invaded Packy-slot gambling machines in Japan only, then returned for a sequel this year. This past summer, fans could try Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night for the iPhone, which followed Puzzle Quest and Puzzle Fighter's approach with Dracula's own custom Gothic design. Along with many classic titles released digitally, a new multiplayer experience launched on Xbox Live Arcade in August, called Harmony of Despair, that unified the lineage of Slayers in sprite form online, similar to their assembly in Judgment. And of course, Lords of Shadow raised questions as to whether we'll ever see more of the series as it was. Will this new bloodline last as long as the first? The Castlevania series has only existed for a quarter of a century, but the timeline covers just under 1,000 years. Some have criticized that, like its blood-sucking antagonist, Castlevania would expire if it didn't feed off others. They point to elements borrowed from Metroid, Devil May Cry, and God of War. But no matter the protagonist or the perspective, there's something unmistakable about flogging the marching undead with the Morning Star while leaping across crumbling platforms suspended over a bed of spikes. It's rare that a video game character transcends its film counterpart, but that's exactly what Konami has done. Dracula can challenge Bowser for the most interactive appearances by the same villain, and it's that consistency that keeps loyal hunters leaping, falling, restarting, and eventually conquering evil. For its faithful and determined followers, Castlevania will always stand for meticulous atmosphere, stunning art design, unforgiving boss encounters, and one hell of a fun challenge.